At the Busan meeting in October between the Chinese and the U.S. presidents, the Chinese President Xi Jinping was quoted saying that the potential of cooperation in artificial intelligence between China and the U.S. is good. He also called upon relevant departments from both sides to increase dialogue and cooperation and develop mutually beneficial cooperation. Since then, we've seen people in the know in both countries increase their efforts. Today, I'm so glad to enjoy the conversation with two of them. Professor Xue Lan, Dean of the Institute for AI International Governance with Tsinghua University. Sam Sachs, Senior Fellow of Povtsai China Center, Yale Law School. Ms. Sam Sachs, Professor Xue Lan, what a pleasure to see both of you here in the Schwarzman College. Thank you for the hospitality. May I ask you, what do you think in terms of the nature of the bilateral relations, China and the U.S.? Where does AI governance fall into the overall landscape?
You do see, the narrative in the U.S. and in the, sort of Western media portraying exactly as a competition. So that indeed, that's what you see and you hear. But I think actually if you look at in Chinese reality, if you talk to Chinese companies and to talk to the people who are in these sort of AI governance related areas, people actually are, at least what I see in China, people are focused much more on the AI application in various application domains, not so much on the frontier models. And that's what I think the Western media is saying, okay, US-China is in this head-to-head competition to see who gets to the AGI first on the frontier model. But actually, most of the Chinese companies, they are really more concerned about how actually we can apply this into medical service, autonomous driving, and other things.
Interesting. You're suggesting, China and the US seem to be going very different ways in terms of working with AI. Is that going to provide both sides with more momentum for cooperation or for competition?
When we talk about very concrete applications, I think that's where it's easier to move the strategic competition lens aside and think about how will this affect people in a real world capacity. Not everything has to be thought of through a national security, through a competition lens. For example, we were talking earlier about autonomous driving, medical applications. These are things where there are narrow, concrete problems that people will have to work through. And maybe it might be that Chinese electric vehicles are not going to be driving on the streets of the US because that has been caught up in strategic competition. But can the US learn from China's experience on things like how do we set up charging infrastructure? What might be the most efficient way to organize a city so that people will make use of the infrastructure and smart vehicles? That's just one example of when you move it down to a very concrete, real-life level, it turns out both sides have a lot to learn and talk about.
Since a few years ago, when there seemed to be more, at least rhetorically, strategic competition between China and the United States, where actually we can search for the new opportunity and look for a new path, a path that can have more common ground.
The first line of America's AI Action Plan says America wants to dominate in AI. I was actually in China at the Shanghai World AI Conference in July when this plan was released. And so I had a lot of questions. What does this mean? America wants to dominate. And one of the things that I encouraged Chinese experts, I said, please read the full plan. Because once you get past this language about domination, you'll actually see there's a lot of commonality in the things we're concerned about, right? There's a section in that plan about preparing workers, making sure that workers have the same are trained with skills for AI. There's a section that talks about malicious information. How can we tell what's real, what's fake? There's a line about using data to promote the development of AI while also protecting data privacy. These are all policy and governance questions that I know people in China care about. So that's in the same action plan as we have to dominate. So we have to accept both realities.
Would you like to accept both realities as termed by Sam, Professor Xue?
There's a rhetoric and there's a policy reality. I was actually, I had a discussion with someone who was involved in drafting the AI action plan. And this first thing that he mentioned, it's interesting. He mentioned he was saying that actually the key word of what he thinks in that AI action plan is actually how to promote the diffusion of AI in various application domains.
What does that mean?
So that's very much almost the same as AI Plus plan, right? I mean, AI action plan, AI Plus plan is pretty much also about the diffusion of technology. And the other thing also the concerns about the fake information, the concern about the risks, I think again, very similar. That really tells us, after all, the two societies, US society and Chinese society, the pursuit of AI for the benefits of the society, I think that drive is the same.
What about the over-politicization of AI governance or AI-related technologies? Will we be able to go beyond those rhetorics? That's a big question mark. Professor Xue, I want you to go first, and then Sam, please join us.
Both the U.S. and China, I think, are very much concerned with the catastrophic risks that AI might generate. China has been very much, in terms of both the government and also the industry, it's really how we can actually have international mechanisms to help to support the governance of that. I think on the U.S. side, again, I might be wrong, so please correct me. My sense is that there's less of an emphasis on the international regimes to guard against that.
You talk about AI governance in terms of, for example, dealing with natural disasters, and the list goes on. That is a common ground, it seems, that the world can have. So now, what has China achieved in terms of coming up with relevant rules, regulations, and also sharing of experiences, working with international partners? What has been achieved?
The Chinese the AI governance has gone through an evolutionary process. I think that China's approach is more adaptive approach. So basically, when China first proposed in 2017, there's a national plan for AI development. I think in that development plan, there was both China wants to push for the technology, but at the same time wants to push for the establishment of a AI governance system. So I think China sees that as two wheels that have to support each other.
Professor Xue, you were earlier involved in this UN panel providing advice for the Secretary General. How is that going? Do we have something already concrete?
China has been involved in all the international dialogue, international mechanisms, including at the UN and also at the multilateral regimes, including G20 and the APEC and so on. So actually our governance principles proposed in 2019 was indeed a direct input to the APEC discussion.
And Sam, go to you. Obviously, Professor Xue intentionally chose another relatively easier area of international cooperation. But that is certainly one area for AI governance cooperation. How much interest is there in Washington and also in the business world? I know you work with the business world as well, in terms of participating in that and therefore creating more common ground, not only with China, but also the others.
To speak candidly, I think there's been a shift in Washington where there's far less interest in working in a multilateral setting.
It's not a national secret anymore.
Exactly. So that may be an area that will be challenging for US-China to see eye to eye on. I want to return to this question you raised about politicization. And specifically, I think one of the issues is both sides need to move away from a national security framing of looking at artificial intelligence. So many of the issues where I think we could find more common ground are hindered by looking at AI purely through a securitized lens. On the issue of regulation and moving away, politics, moving away from a security lens, I want to compliment China on some areas where I think the regulations have been addressing some real problems, and there's lessons to be learned from that. One is in thinking about minors and the kinds of content or algorithms that are pushing information to minors. This is a huge problem in the US, and I think China's been very forward in thinking about how can we regulate when it comes to the ways that youth are interacting with algorithms and online. And the second area has to do with watermarking content. Yeah. So the regulatory environment is moving very quickly in China, and I think there are valuable lessons to be learned for governments around the world.
We actually talked to some of the Chinese AI companies about regulations, and because we've been promoting the so-called agile governance. We're basically saying that the government and the companies should not play the cat and mouse game. But basically, we said the two should sit together to figure out what's really going on, particularly with the way technology moves. And I think the companies fully agree, and they said actually, in many cases, it's not that something that they know, they hide from the government, but rather they said, we don't know either. When we move forward, what are the potential risks? So there's what they call the joint ignorance of the risks. So I think in that case, I think there are two ways. One is that for potential really, really bad, I mean like AI out of control, that really sort of catastrophic risk, for those cases, you do need to be somewhat anticipatory, regulations. And you need to have some guardrail, some red lines that you don't want to touch. So that's sort of one type of things. But there are some other risks that's less onerous. And then you may want to say, let's first try this, and then see what are the side effects. And if they are indeed very serious, and then let's stop it. And so I think that's sort of probably, I would say, the kind of a dual
track in a way, yeah. But what does that take to have that dual track? Political commitment? What else?
Well, I think
from a governance perspective.
Yeah, from the governance point of view, I think in China certainly that has been the approach that China has been moving along. That a lot of the regulation, like the watermark and so on, that's sort of the track, that's sort of adaptive approach. On the other hand, there are indeed red lines and so on. That's where I think that it's clear that you don't want the government to, you don't want the company to touch. So I think that's a dual track.
Ms. Sachs, can you help me to understand the situation in the US? Is the president interested in this? For example, AI governance within the country and also cooperation with others, especially with China?
There is a robust debate in Washington, and I don't think that there's consensus. And
Not yet.
And I think we've seen this play out even in the last few months around questions of NVIDIA and chip controls, for example. There's no consensus on this. There's a very live debate. And so the next few months leading up to the president's potentially meeting in China, which it sounds like it's on track. And I will say, I think that there is strong interest in both sides to having that meeting take place and having it be successful. But there is not consensus about the specific details of what might be an agreement or a framework that needs to be hammered out before then.
We see the US put forward the AI action plan. In the AI action plan, of course, these language are very strategic and sometimes rhetorical as in many documents. It is clearly marked that the US is to achieve AI dominance worldwide. Now, there are many documents like this with words like this, and therefore, how the community like yours, academic, together with the business side, be able to work with politics inside your country to come around and make sure these languages can be fulfilled, but at the same time, many of the important jobs can be done along the way.
So here I think is where the adaptive process is going to be very important, and having strong public-private partnerships, because we don't know the answers to all of these questions, right? So being able to have an open channel of communication between industry, between policymakers, between the academics and the research labs. So as we learn more, we can have the ability to make real-time adjustments, regulatory sandboxes. And here I think these are, again, areas where the US and China in their approach actually have a lot in common.
In the Busan meeting at the airport, both presidents talked to one another, and apparently the outcome of that meeting is being welcomed so far by the international community, including peoples in both countries. Professor Xue, the Chinese side in its readout was talking about having potential of cooperation is good for both countries in terms of AI governance. That is coming from the Chinese side. Now, as a Chinese scholar, how do you think you can prepare within the Chinese system to work with different stakeholders so that some relevant plans can be provided to politicians when they have future opportunities to meet, to give AI governance a better opportunity?
I think that in the U.S. and in Washington, D.C., probably there are people in the U.S. Administration and probably people in the Congress who probably may have not the full, picture of China's AI development reality. And so I think that having that sort of basic understanding is really important. So if we can build channels of that sort of understanding, I think that it seems to me that before we even get to any policies, let's just sort of build that understanding.
What are these channels you're thinking about, Professor?
Well, I think that, for example, I think I would certainly welcome, the people from the U.S. administration or the Congress to come, to China and to come to Schwarzman College. The second thing, of course, we can do is to see what are some of the, potential ideas, potential policy initiatives in areas that we can collaborate, to work together.
What is on your mind now?
Well, I think, for example, let's think about health. In health areas, that there could be potentially, I think, given the powerful AI tools, I think the U.S.-China can work together. I mean, U.S.-China has worked together in pushing so many areas in the frontiers. I study S&T policy, and I see there are many joint publications, was probably among the highest of the U.S. Prior to the this confrontation. So I think that is huge potential to address the problem.
You have debates here in China as to what to do. Where does AI and technology-wise, AI governance cooperation-wise, between China and the United States? Let's just use NVIDIA just as an example. Earlier, the export ban certainly has filled an industry of chip making here in China. No doubt about it. People are very proud that they are jumping into the field. But now, of course, policies are changing. But here in China, you have this debate. Should we continue with on our own? Or should we think about other options as part of the picture? But what about the Americans? They're not giving us the best ones. And probably they have backdoor as well in their products. Should we trust them? Or should we just leisurely buy some, Or what about the competition? Maybe some of the Chinese chips, they're pretty good, but they're not yet the best in the world. Would they provide more competition against the Chinese chips if the good ones are really coming in?
We have to recognize that, China's S&T capability has been built, over the last 40 plus years, been gradually moving forward and with, stronger and stronger. And I think that initially people say, okay, China has been relying on the, international side, the foreign technology too much. That debate, I think, has been going on for quite some time. But now with China becoming stronger, people say, hey, now we can be totally on our own. I think that's a false assumption, because I think if you look at in science, technology, and innovation area, no single country can just rely on itself. I think I've been watching this, and for example, if you look at the patent royalty fees, guess who's number one? The paid royalty. That means you have to buy technology from other countries. Guess which country is number one?
China.
No.
United States.
United States. Yeah. So even though indeed United States, everybody recognizes the U.S. is strong, right? But the U.S. still has to, buy a lot of technology from other side. China is number two. So that means you really have to rely on, working with others and trying to learn from others without having to reinvent the wheel. So that's the first thing, that you do have to have that international cooperation. At the same time, also, now I think the last 10 years or so have taught us you can't rely entirely on the foreign technology. You do have to be prepared. Sometimes you will get being choked on critical technologies, and sometimes you might have other things. So I think you also have to have your own resilience. You have to own capabilities.
But the degrees of which one, at what time, how they work with one another will be very critical.
Yeah, sure. I think that is now coming to let's use the chip as one example. Certainly China will not give up in developing its own chip technology, no matter what. I think now China is prepared to move forward on that. At the same time, I think if the U.S. is open up for chip sales to China, then that's great. Let the company to decide. Each company, they know what's best for them at this particular time. So let them decide.
Yeah. Sam, does that debate also apply to where you are in the U.S.?
Absolutely. I mean, I think both sides need to start from the assumption that there is debate and that there are messy realities in both countries. And only then can I think we get to some clarity. I really agree with this point about interconnection. And I think what we've seen is a sort of course correction from an extreme on both sides, where there's been rhetoric of self-reliance and needing to weaponize choke points. And what I hope will happen is that leaders in both capitals can understand that ultimately interconnection is in the national interest of both sides. And then the question becomes, what does interconnection look like, rather than how can we eliminate vulnerability through interconnection. It's what is the way that interconnection can maximize prosperity, health.
What is the nature of this relationship between China and the U.S.? Is it going to be more power related? Or is it going to be, let's think about ways to avoid conflicts. Let's think about ways in which we can peacefully coexist. And probably as a result of that, both of us can win in a way.
The strategic competition and power frame to look at the US-China relationship is not going to go away. I think that's the fundamental reality. So then the question is, how can we make competition into a source of something positive? There are areas where competition doesn't have to be a race to the bottom, but can actually fuel innovation on both sides for the good of humanity. But I think it would be naive to say that power and great competition is not going to be a part of the US-China relationship as we go forward. And as a result of that, it is so difficult for industry insiders like you to pick an area and try to suggest that this area we can go much deeper, even when it comes to data, even when it comes to technology-wise, even when it comes to product, we can share. If we think about the US, the national interest, whether you're talking about security, safety, prosperity, coexistence can benefit all of those interests, right? So assume the strategic competition lens is not going away. Then we have to think about what is in the best national interest. And I would argue that across all of those areas, coexistence between the US and China will benefit national prosperity, national security, and the well-being of humans. Go to you, Professor Xue, your thoughts.
Yeah, I think this really gets to the the vision of each country. What do you see as the future global order, right? I think that for China, and China certainly sees the global order is moving into a multipolar world, and China wanted to be a constructive part of that. So that's sort of the vision that we have. Certainly, I think, of course, there will be, competition, between U.S. and China, but also there will be collaboration. This is the same as in this market competition. You have the market leaders who are both, compete, but also have to collaborate. So I think I totally agree with Sam. I think that actually coexistence, collaborate in many areas and, compete in some other areas. I think that probably is something that in the next, probably, I guess, hopefully in a shorter time, but I would say probably in the next 10, 15 years, and there's probably time needed for the U.S.-China to figure out what's the best way the two can work together.
Professor Xue Lan and Ms. Sam Sachs, what a pleasure to see both of you here in the Schwarzman College. Thank you once again, Professor Xue, for that hospitality.
Pleasure, and come more.
All right. And Sam, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you.